I am introducing Kat and Lester, and they will be giving their talk on digital damage control.
No, that doesn't work. There it is. Yeah. All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Kat. I've been doing public relations for cybersecurity companies for about 5 years now. I am also on the board for the Cloud Security Alliance Arizona chapter, which is where Lester and I met and came up with this amazing presentation. I also work with the Pacific Hackers Association, who is here right now. They just got done with their talk. I also do a lot of work in the health and wellness and fitness space out here in Arizona, which is where I'm based.
And I do not do anything with health, wellness, or fitness. So I'm the more senior of the two here. So I'm Lester Godsey. I'm the Chief Information Security Officer for Arizona State University. And I happened to be in the room earlier where that 17-year-old young man hacked ASU. So I will say, so I came up, said I enjoyed your talk. I gave him my card. He didn't even look at it. And so, yeah. Apparently, he was not impressed. So
hire him.
Yeah, I do want to hire that kid. But prior to that, I was the CISO for Maricopa County for the five previous years. So me and my team, we lived through the 2020 and the 2024 elections. We'll talk a little bit about that in the context of this topic. I was also the CISO for City of Mesa, and man, I've just been around, so I've had a bunch of other roles. So
round and around and around.
So just to give a little context about this presentation, why Kat and I came up with this idea. And so we wanted to take a different approach along these lines. So for those of you that know me, I've presented on multiple occasions about the impact of misdis and malinformation, but it had always been in the context of cybersecurity and cybersecurity alone. And so I thought with Kat's background from a communications crisis management perspective, we could present a more unique and interesting perspective on, from an organizational perspective, why this topic of digital damage control, specifically around misdis and malinformation on traditional and social media, was so important. But the first thing is, for those of you in the room that are on the cyber side of things, I'm of the opinion, having lived through, again, the I guess, battle damage of the 2020 and 2024 elections, that the role that cybersecurity plays from an enterprise risk perspective has to change. We can't just be focused on the traditional IOCs. Oh, let's look at firewall logs. Let's look at endpoint, et cetera, because at the end of the day, organizations care more about the risks they're facing, and the nature of the risks that they're facing is broader in scope, in particular with regards to reputational impact. So one of the themes that you'll see in our presentation is between communications and cybersecurity, one or both of us has to be the canary in the coal mine. And I'm of the opinion that social media in particular is that coal mine. And that's an indication of the kind of risks that you and your organization might be facing. The second thing is, this is no longer something that can be clearly delineated between your SOC versus your communications team versus your compliance team. This needs to be a holistic, all hands on deck approach, given the threats that we are all collectively facing. And this is something that's not just unique to, well, higher ed in my case, or local government. It's private sector, it's all the different verticals. Everybody needs to take a more holistic, shared approach to the kind of risks that we're facing today.
All right. And so I'd like to say that the way that communications for crisis management is not the same that it was 5 years ago. We need to learn how to evolve with technology. So at this point, we should be no stranger that social media runs the world when it comes to information sharing. So the old playbook of taking your time, triple checking everything, and then running it through 5 different departments doesn't work anymore, because social media can make a crisis hit within minutes instead of days.
And so what to expect out of our presentation. So some of the things that you should take away is, number one, sorry, my head keeps on going in front of the projector. So I happen to have a big one, unfortunately. But the impact that social media has had in shaping public perception, regardless of accuracy. So like what Kat's talked about and what she specializes in addresses that. Also from a cyber perspective, how do we handle misdis and malinformation from an organizational perspective? So from a traditional point of view, cybersecurity shops, SecOps in particular, tends to be pretty good about certain things like credential harvesting or intrusion attempts, DDoS attacks, et cetera, et cetera. But what about cyber-based threats that originate from social media, in particular from a misdis and malinformation perspective?
So a fun statistic that I found was, according to the Pew Research Center, over half of U.S. adults get some of their news from social media. So it's really hard for people who are not in our industry to know what's true or what's not. So we really have a role here in informing the public about what to do. We'll also give you some tips and tricks to bring back to your company for how to monitor, respond quickly, and prevent reputational damage.
Yep.
So why should you care? A poorly handled crisis can lead to your company's reputation being ruined, market value dropping, and even to loss of customers. I've seen companies lose millions of dollars before they even get their crisis team on a call. So it's not just about stock price. Customers will get spooked and then they'll start walking away. So people start boycotting your products. And suddenly your sales team is on an uphill battle just to keep your existing accounts. Then comes the bills, the legal bills, the crisis PR firms, the technical fixes. They add up pretty fast. Then there's your reputation. You can spend years, if not decades, building up your trust within your customers, and a single tweet can burn that all within seconds. So once the media picks up a story, you kind of lose control of the narrative.
Did I mention I worked at Maricopa County?
Yeah.
Yeah. And so that particular point that Kat shared really hits home, right? And so regardless of your opinion about government, and everybody's entitled to their opinion, as a government employee for 27 years in one fashion or another, trust by our citizenry is kind of the lowest, or the currency by which we deliver services, right? And so if our constituents don't trust us, it's very hard for us to accomplish our goals, which is to deliver service and, in my previous role, support and provide services to the 4.6 million residents of Maricopa County, right? So yeah. Everything. And I would also argue, and I know you're of this belief too, so even if you're in the private sector, reputation matters. Your ability to make money, to achieve your collective goal from an organizational perspective, in large part, is becoming more and more dependent on a brand and reputation.
Yeah, so it's not just about PR anymore, it's about survival at this point.
So just to level set, and I'm not going to belabor these following points because I think most of you know what misdis and malinformation is, but I do want to point out a couple of things. So ultimately, from a both cybersecurity as well as communication perspective, the most important thing to take away from this slide is not so much the definitions, but the intent behind that, right? Meaning misinformation is unintentional false information. And so probably the best example, and a number of you have heard this from me in previous presentations, when I was at Maricopa County, there was an image that was trending on social media. And so for those of you who were unaware of this, in our recorder's office, who's responsible for elections, they had basically a clear, I guess, cage, for lack of a better description, where the Dominion equipment was set up. It was all air gapped, and there was an actual camera that was pointing to that 24/7 for purposes of transparency. And so the image in question was one where there was a piece of paper on this glass wall, and that if you had zoomed in, it said username and password, right? And so we were able to use third-party software to prove that that was a doctored image, right? And so, but legitimately, the post that we had stumbled across in our threat hunting and intelligence gathering, we're of the belief that the person who shared that legitimately thought that was a legit picture, right? And so they were doing this in a benign manner, but they were spreading information. And so the important takeaway there is intent. Whereas in disinformation, and in some instances, malinformation is even potentially more dangerous, the intent makes all the difference in the world. So whether you're a comms person or whether you're a cybersecurity person, if somebody's intentionally attacking you, that obviously changes the amount of threat that's posed to your organization. So it's important to know, to the degree possible, how to infer what the threat level is. So in the case of disinformation, obviously, we've seen that weaponized in multiple instances, from nation states to hacktivists and everybody in between. And malinformation is an interesting idea in that you're using basically true factual statements, but you're changing the narrative in some instance to cause damage against an individual and or organization, right? So, but in those two latter examples, intent makes all the difference in the world, and it helps inform between a communications perspective and a cybersecurity perspective how you should approach that.
So you're saying the comms teams and the cybersecurity teams need to work together, right?
Yeah, I am kind of saying that. Yeah.
So which of the three do you think is the worst? Because to me, it sounds like malinformation is the worst.
So I'm of the opinion it depends on the situation. And so, again, most relevant example that comes to mind was the election cycles, right? And so in some instances, you would think malinformation would be the worst because what's that adage? The best lies have a sprinkle of truth in them, right? But in those instances, that was a situation where I think disinformation, it was actually more harmful. Michael Moore in the audience may disagree, but I think disinformation was more impactful because it was specifically timed associated with the election. So there was a short window of opportunity, and their intent from our discussions with our three-letter agency partners was to sow as much discontent and cause social unrest as possible. And so in that instance, the disinformation, which was purely in a lot of instances not factual whatsoever, was able to accomplish that. Whereas malinformation has a sprinkle of truth of it. And so in that instance, maybe it has less effective, if you will, in terms of that pot stirring. So I think it really depends on the situation, what the intended outcome is by the threat actor or group, that sort of thing. So it really depends.
Yep. All right, so we're going to go through some case studies of different cyber attacks and different situations that happened, and he's going to break it down from a cyber perspective, and I'll break it down from a comms perspective, what went wrong and what went right. So our first one is Colonial Pipeline. We kind of went back and forth on this one a little bit. Yes. So did they. Yeah. This one was the first one that I thought of, so I won the fight on this one.
There was no fight. I just do whatever the hell you told me to do. So
I really. But this one was my favorite because I felt like it was a perfect example of how social media just caused panic when it came to they didn't know what was going on. So I'll let you go into like what happened during the cyber perspective, and then I'll go into the comms.
Yeah. So from a cyber perspective, the actual impact was, I don't want to say minimal, but there wasn't as many variables or factors in this particular use case. I will say from a social media speculation perspective, the initial event, there was a lot of speculation on social media, which caused some confusion. There were rumors about, hey, this was a nation state-based attack. This was a hacktivist or even insider threat. And then ultimately it was determined that it was a ransomware attack by DarkSide, right? And so the only other thing from a cybersecurity perspective, and again, no intention on speculation whatsoever with regards to how they responded from a cybersecurity perspective, but the other impact specifically that social media had was the potential accurate dissemination of information as to what was going on. I don't know about their organization, in particular, the SecOps team. So were they looped in as to what the internal workings were and the discovery ultimately that it was a ransomware attack by DarkSide, or were they scouring social media for threat intelligence and things of that sort? So, but suffice it to say, it is a safe statement to say that social media did have an impact in terms of that dissemination of information and the response by the company and other government agencies.
So that picture I had sent, who remembers the Colonial Pipeline and all of the pictures online of people filling their trash bags full of gasoline? Yeah, great, okay.
That's why you won the fight.
It's like, why do you do that? It's crazy. So this is a perfect example of what happens in a crisis situation when you go completely silent and you don't inform the public about what's happening. So when the attack first hit, they didn't say anything about it, and then people started filling in the void. So they started coming up with things like, there's a gas shortage. We don't know when we're going to get gas again. So then that's when we came up with the panic. So once people started freaking out, they kind of lost control of the story. So once that started getting into the news, like, what do you do then? They didn't give clear guidance to the gas stations or the public about what to expect. So again, people started panicking, and that's what happens when you don't communicate clearly. They then proceeded to pay the $4.4 million in Bitcoin, which is tricky enough, but they also didn't inform the public about what happened. So that information leaked, and people started running wild with that story as well.
So along those lines, keep that comment about the leak in mind. We're going to talk about appropriate communication channels.
And then the CEO goes on TV looking uncoordinated, didn't look like he knew what he was talking about at all, and then admitted that they didn't work with the government when it came to paying the ransom. So talk about shooting yourself in the foot, right? They then got the pipeline back up in about 5 days, which is pretty impressive given the scale of the attack. So there were some things that we can learn from this situation. So once they got their act together, they started giving better updates, and then they started working with the government to calm people down. Afterwards, they invested pretty heavily in cybersecurity, which to me means that they learned their lesson pretty well. So the key takeaway with this situation was that speed beats perfection in crisis communication. Would they have taken some heat for saying that they got attacked? Sure. But they made it worse by not saying anything to begin with. Next one is COVID-19. Who remembers that?
Nice.
It was bad times. I lived in Seattle at the time, so that was great.
Excellent. And so, okay, so from a COVID-19 perspective, again, this was during my tenure at Maricopa County. Maricopa County played a big role with COVID-19. And look, not to make this a political conversation about vaccine, no vaccine, that sort of thing, but regardless, between the public health, which, so from a regional perspective, Maricopa County played a big role along those lines, but also that correctional health. So apparently when you're jailed, you still have to have health coverage, right? So, but one of the things that we saw, and you know, us as cybersecurity professionals, we tend to see social media phishing campaigns that are cyclical in nature, right? So like every March, for example, you see an uptick on the type of phishing campaigns around taxes and the IRS and all that other stuff. And obviously, just like good cybersecurity people, threat actors let no crisis go to waste. So it got to the point where Maricopa County and my team, we were tracking COVID-19 related attacks, both from a phishing perspective as well as other sorts of cyber attacks. And so obviously we saw an influx of misinformation along those lines, phishing and scams in particular, especially those in turn towards entities and health. So, and again, like Kat mentioned, whether you agree with it or not, a lot of people go on social media for their actual news and information, as opposed to official websites, which I've been told is old school. So I must be old school. So, fake COVID-19 tracking apps and links, those were disguised as official resources. And so they were doing things like trying to deploy malicious payloads, credential harvesting, et cetera, et cetera. And so we also saw an increase in social engineering attacks based off of COVID-19 because from a societal perspective, we had an apt and interested audience, if you will. Everybody was starving, looking for information along those lines, and so it made people less, disciplined and careful with regards to what they were looking for. Interestingly enough, one of the weird outcomes was this whole concept of Zoom bombing. And so by show of hands, how many of you have been in a meeting during that period of time where your meeting got bombed, right? So that was a combination of things. I mean, in some instances, not to throw vendors under the bus, they didn't necessarily have the appropriate security controls in place. A lot of it was just, PEPCAC. Yeah, for those of you, Google it. So, improper configuration. But because everybody was mobile, all of a sudden video conferencing took off. And then, I saw firsthand at Maricopa County, and I'm sure a lot of you did as well by the show of hands, Zoom bombing along those lines. And then reputational attacks again. And so that was a situation where Maricopa County, our comms department, actually, not to steal your thunder, Kat.
That wasn't me, by the way.
No, it was not you. It's not you. So that was somebody else. They were tracking that very carefully, right? Because there was a lot of misinformation. There was a lot of attacks against agencies that were specifically responsible for providing guidance and direction along those lines, which I know you're going to talk about.
Yeah, so COVID-19 was crazy. None of us really knew what to do because it's not like any of us really went through a pandemic before. So we saw a lot of fragmented messaging and how it derailed a lot of crisis communications. So when the pandemic hit, there was a lot of warnings, which created a lot of alert fatigue instead of awareness. And then a lot of IT teams were speaking in cybersecurity terms that not a lot of people in the normal world understand. I would say that I've been doing this for a while and I don't understand a lot of cybersecurity stuff. So a lot of people were left confused and they didn't know what to do. So this created a lot of vulnerabilities left open. So like you had said, there was a lot of the IRS scams, a lot of phishing emails. We also saw a lot of people working from home. This was new. We didn't see that very often until this hit. So the initial chaos was really bad. So it left, like I said, a lot of people confused, but we saw some recovery. So organizations began providing some regular updates. They were clear about phishing tactics and gave some real world examples of how to combat these. So the lesson was in this situation that technical jargon can confuse people. So just because you're really smart and you know what's going on doesn't mean other people are going to understand you. Just making sure you're communicating clearly to your audience and understanding who your audience is. It can create panic if you don't, right?
Yeah, and I think, again, just using this example as well as the last one, so again, a lot of the concerns and a lot of the risk against organizations in many ways stem from social media, right? Because that's where everybody was going. And so hence one of the reasons why we're doing this presentation. By a show of hands, how many of your organizations actively do threat hunting or intelligence gathering on social media? So honestly, more than I thought. And so what I would encourage for the rest of you to take away from this is social media is, in my opinion, the new canary in the coal mine. And so whether it's your cyber team, whether it's your comms team, or some combination thereof, and we're going to talk about approaches and tactics along those lines, strongly consider taking that back to your organization.
And don't worry, we left TikTok out of this presentation. So our next example is Russia, Ukraine. We all remember that as well. It wasn't that long ago.
And technically still going, right? So, yeah. So, next slide. So this one is interesting too. So I'm going to go a little off track here. And so many of you may be thinking to yourself, oh, why are we talking about this and what relevance does this actually have to all of us? Well, I can't speak to all of us, but I can speak to me and my previous gigs. So when that occurred, so literally the day after Russia invaded Ukraine, at Maricopa County, they block all ingress and egress traffic from a geographic perspective. So one of the countries that Maricopa County blocks is Russia. And so the day after Russia invaded Ukraine, we saw the number of connection attempts from Russian IP address space. And again, I get it. You can obfuscate your IP address. That's super easy. But trust me when I say that nation states, oftentimes they just don't care. They'll just do it straight from their IP address space. And unless they're specifically targeting you, and then they'll obfuscate that, right? So the day after Russia invaded Ukraine, we saw the number of connection attempts from that region double. And then that weekend, we saw that number increase to 10 times what the norm was. And so, and I know it was a concerted attack against government agencies because I had a conversation with a CISO from a Fortune 100 in the financial sector, and he corroborated that during that period of time, they saw the number of connection attempts from Russian IP address space actually dip. So what that tells me anecdotally, because I didn't have a big enough sample size, but anecdotally what that tells me was the Russian nation state was actually targeting us and all government, and they weren't being picky about it. They weren't just picking on the federal government, by the way. So, but in that particular example, what we saw was more of a weaponization than the previous examples, in my opinion, of social media on both sides. So again, not taking sides here along those lines. Both those folks from Ukraine as well as Russia were weaponizing social media. Along those lines, they were doing things like recruitment and radicalization of folks. And so for those of you that recall, that radicalization and the impact of social media wasn't just like one side versus another side. We also saw internal leaks. So for those of you who recall the Conti leaks, right? That actually was something out of a hacking group that was affiliated with the GRU in Russia, right? And so their own internal hackers were like, yeah, I'm not feeling this. And so they leaked a bunch of information, right? And so we saw a lot of that. A lot of that was initiated on social media. Deepfakes and synthetic media. And so I'm of the belief that right around the 2022 mark, and I'll talk about this in our next use case, but 2022, in my opinion, is when deepfake videos in particular started getting really good and pretty believable, right? And so for those of you who don't recall, there was a video that was spreading of President Zelensky from Ukraine, encouraging his residents and his fighters to put arms down, right? And so, and I know you're going to talk about how they responded along those lines. So we saw cases of doxing and cyber stalking on both sides of the conflict itself, ransomware, cyber extortion, and just overall using social media to spread panic and misinformation on both sides. So really, the Russian-Ukraine is probably one of the better examples of the actual weaponization of social media from a conflict perspective.
Yeah, so this case was really interesting to me because it was a lot different than the other ones that we've seen. Essentially, they had to rewrite the whole crisis playbook when it came to dealing with what was going on. So their websites were under attack. They went down. They didn't have any way to communicate with people. So once deepfakes started coming out, Zelensky went straight to social media. And so this was a new way to get information out to the public. This wasn't something that people were really used to using as their main form of communication. So they did struggle a lot with information overload, so trying to verify what was a potential threat while also combating sophisticated disinformation. But instead of getting bogged down, they decided to use social media. So they switched over to adapting and then started working with international partners. So a lot of tech companies stepped in and kind of helped them get the message out about what was real and what wasn't. So this kind of helped with calming the public down. So this is definitely your wheelhouse for this one.
Yeah. So, so I joke that the biggest reason why I took the ASU job is because I was tired of dealing with death threats, right? So, unfortunately, that's not an inaccurate statement. So, but 2020 and 2024 election cycle in particular. And so let me preface this by saying, this amount of information on social media, it's not like it didn't exist prior to those two election cycles. And so I was told by my colleagues at Maricopa County who had been there longer, actually, they saw evidence of this during the 2016 election. So there was somebody, for example, who was back when it was called tweeting and back when it was called Twitter.
I still call it that. I refuse.
Yeah, you're old school. What can I say? So, but back then, even in 2016, somebody had posted something on Twitter saying that a polling site was closed and not accepting anybody, right? And so that was a situation. Well, even back then, Maricopa County had protocols in place. They informed the ACTIC, which is Arizona Counterterrorism Information Center. Is that right? Yeah, thank you. I'm horrible with acronyms. And so then they coordinated with the FBI in that instance who had somebody at Twitter, and then that account was shut down within an hour period. And so we'd already seen evidence of it, but honestly, 2020 was when we saw it fully weaponized, 100%. And so, and then 2024 was interesting as well. So one thing that you might not be aware of, and so from a cybersecurity planning perspective, it's not just a source of intelligence, right? We had seen multiple instances where social media was being used as a logistics planning platform. And so what do I mean by that? So one example was my ops team had seen on a publicly accessible post that they were setting up a sign-up sheet to establish a schedule for a caravan to follow all the election staff between polling locations. And so that was, I think that might have been Facebook. I'm not quite sure. There was another situation where we were monitoring Twitter, X. It was still Twitter back then. And so we were monitoring Twitter, and somebody was posting that they just happened to be hanging out, aka stalking, us and the recorder's building. So they were outside the building for the department that was responsible for elections. They noticed that this big truck was being loaded with equipment. They immediately jumped to the conclusion that it was a piece of voting equipment and we were disposing of the evidence. So what we were disposing of was an old piece of crap multifunction device, aka printer copier device. And so they're posting this on Twitter, and then people are obviously encouraging that person to follow the truck. And so next thing they know, they're live streaming this stuff. And so what they didn't know is they are actually following a sheriff's deputy. And so
It's really scary.
yeah, so last time I checked, the cops don't like to be followed. So I don't know. So but joking aside, so we caught wind of this while this was occurring. And so we were able to let law enforcement, in that case, Maricopa County Sheriff's Office, know, hey, you might have somebody on your tail. And so that could easily turn into a kinetic physical event causing harm for one or both parties involved, right? And so not a lot of us think about social media in that context. We think about misdeeds and malinformation, which is still important, don't get me wrong. But from a logistics perspective, that maybe is something that we're not all thinking about, right? And so, and I do want to maybe go off track a little bit. And so when I was at Maricopa County, we were very conscious about the delineation between our role as cybersecurity professionals and then servants to our residents and our constituents, right? And so everybody has the right to peacefully protest. And so we would see, obviously, on social media calls to protest the election, et cetera, which is well within their rights. However, from a security perspective, the approach we took was we still needed to be aware of those things that were occurring because those pose a potential heightened risk to the organization. Didn't mean we're going to try to stop anybody. Didn't mean we're going to try to censor anybody. What it did mean was we were going to communicate that risk, AKA this theme that Kat and I have shared here in this presentation of canary in coal mine, right? So oftentimes my security team would be the first ones to know about, hey, by the way, there's a call for protests at this location at this time, pass that information along within the organization. So there was a situation, this is unusual, and so it wasn't any of the big social media platforms, and I'm not going to mention who the vendor is, but during the leading up to the 2020 election cycle, there was a third-party SaaS service that specialized in citizen engagement. And so it was a platform used to allow citizens to share thoughts, perspectives, et cetera, et cetera. It just happened that Maricopa County was a customer of this platform, and we caught wind from a threat feed from a fusion center on the East Coast saying there was anomalous behavior on this platform. And so we took a look at it because we were a customer. Turned out that there was an inordinate number of registrations for new accounts, and so which was highly unusual. So make a long story short, we worked with the vendor and some of our 3-letter agency partners, and then we determined that it was a bot that was being launched against that site that was auto-registering tens of thousands of accounts. Our federal partners believed that it was a nation-state-based attack, specifically Russia, for purposes of trying to influence social sentiment around the elections. And so that was a very unusual instance. One thing I want to talk about with regards to deepfakes, again, we saw deepfakes in 2020. They weren't really good. And so most of us didn't believe them. In 2024, nobody was laughing. And so the tools, the technology, even the free stuff, has gotten so much better in a relatively short period of time. And so that was something that we had to combat, again, using speed like you talked about, Kat. And then lastly, social media was, again, used for threatening and harassing employees. And so things had gotten so bad after the 2020 election that that administration directed the Department of Justice to work with the FBI to create a task force to help protect elected officials and then election-based staff. So, and it was serious. And so to give you some context along those lines, things were so bad that some of my elected officials, when I was at the county, had to hire physical security services to protect themselves and their families. And as a result, we had to update our incident response protocols such that if we ran across on social media credible evidence of threats, that we knew who to contact in those instances so they could action upon that information and intelligence. And so this is pretty serious, right? And so, but everybody loves to see how the sausage is made. So anyways.
Yeah, I definitely thought this one was yours. So to me, the 2020 and the 2024 election was basically a what not to do that turned into a what to do right. So in 2022 or 2020, it was like everyone was speaking a different language. So again, we were dealing with—
She's not talking about Maricopa County though, right?
I would never.
Okay. Just checking.
We were also dealing with COVID-19 at the time. So we were getting a lot of, like I had said, from the COVID-19 an example, a lot of technical jargon from people. So it was like everyone was speaking a different language and no one knew what was right or not. You had one jurisdiction saying one thing and then another one saying something completely different. So voters were stuck in the middle and didn't really know what was going on. By 2024, we kind of figured it out. So instead of waiting for problems to explode, they built warning systems through public-private partnerships, so CISA, and they stepped in as the main voice, which kind of helped clear all of the bad stuff that was happening. So that was the lesson.
Yep.
Okay. And I'll take this one.
Oh, you want to swap?
Yeah. All right, so this one is my wheelhouse. So how many people have companies that don't have a crisis team or a plan in hand for when something happens? Yeah, it's pretty common. So smaller companies don't necessarily have the resources or the money to be throwing at a situation like this. So I kind of broke down the team that you should be building. So the first person is the crisis lead. This is going to be the person that's going to be the face of the company. So they're going to be the one that's speaking to the media, relaying messages to your stakeholders, all that good stuff. You want to make sure that they know what they're talking about, though. So you don't want to have someone that's going to be speaking to people like we saw with Colonial that doesn't know what they're talking about. It's going to make you look bad and, again, ruin your reputation. So this person's typically going to be your CEO, another executive leader of the team, or someone you really trust. The next is your communications and PR team. That is me. So a lot of companies don't necessarily, like I said, have the money to be having a full-on PR team. I know from a lot of companies that I've worked with, you can contract out work. So we'd be more than happy to just have a little crisis PR plan for you. So we're going to help you create your messaging. What does your company want to say, and how do we convey that properly to the public? Yeah, like I said, we'll do a lot of contract work. We'll help with the media. So if media inquiries come in, they're going to be the ones that are going to be reaching out to me, and I'm going to be the one that's telling you which ones you should respond to and how you should respond to it. The next is going to be your legal and compliance team. You're going to want to find a lawyer who understands cybersecurity. You do not want someone who's a divorce lawyer dealing with this, right? Because they're not going to understand what's going on. So, yeah.
No, I was going to make a joke, but then I thought it would fall flat. So,
you said it.
well, hey, unless you want to get divorced from your organization. So, anyways.
You're right. People probably shouldn't have said that. All right.
Yeah, thanks.
So having this person on hand is going to tell you what the policies are and what the correct legal terms are for the situation, so you don't get in trouble.
So one thing I do want to throw out, by show of hands, do we have any attorneys in the room? Oh, crap. Really? Okay. So I'm going to say it anyways. I don't care. So one of the things, so in addition to not being a divorce attorney, it's an interesting balance. So when you work with your legal, it's been my experience, this is my third time around the horn as a CISO. It's been my experience, sometimes attorneys tend to be very risk adverse. They want to make sure they have all the facts so they can make the right decision. So you, from an organizational perspective, because we're talking about misinformation or attacks based off of social media, speed is of the essence. So that's a conversation that you want to, have that conversation with your attorneys ahead of time, talk about, hey, time is of the essence, and so we may not have all the facts, and so decisions might need to be made in a time schedule that you might be uncomfortable with. Was that politically acceptable to the two attorneys in the room? So I'll take so. Thank you, sir. So
I mean, you don't always have to listen to them, right? So.
You said that, not me. So.
I mean, if they're not understanding, they know your company more than you do, so they can give you advice, but ultimately it's your decision to really listen to what they're saying. So also, last but not least, we have our IT and cybersecurity team. This whole presentation is about how communications teams and cybersecurity teams can work together. I will be the first to admit that I didn't even know how to work a computer when I started this job. I was some hippie kid living in Washington. So learning how to work a computer and learning all of the cybersecurity jargon was really difficult for me. And it kind of still is, but I understand what's happening. So having your cybersecurity team telling you what's going on, they're going to be the one that's monitoring what's happening in the back end. They're going to help me understand what's going on so that I can relay that to the company and, in the end, the media.
But in fairness to you, Kat, it works both ways, right? So, and I don't want to overly stereotype, but not a lot of us in IT or cybersecurity should also be in front of a mic speaking to the media either, right? And so
I've heard that very often.
So I've had I've done on a handful of occasions had to talk to the media. And so you really have to make sure you have your act together. And not only, and part of the challenge is not speaking in terms that the intended audience has no idea, right? And so I see our role more like giving you, from a technical perspective, the factual information so you're not saying anything that's incorrect. But then your communications experts actually crafting the message in a way that's understandable to the intended audience, which we IT nerds may or may not be great at. So,
but I love that you guys understand that, and I don't feel like I'm afraid to ask questions. So if I don't understand something, they're usually really good about like helping me out. So I love that. It's very nice. Skipped over one, but we are running a little bit late on time. I do have my LinkedIn linked at the end. So if anyone needs any help when it comes to building out a crisis team or a plan, or need help with templates, hit me up and I will be more than happy to help you guys out if you have any questions. So I don't know what you're doing.
I hit. It's the next slide.
That I wasn't done with the last one, so we'll hit
sorry,
that.
my bad.
So once you build out your team, it's really important to build out a plan. So not only identifying who's going to be in charge of speaking to the media, who's in charge of AR, so keeping your employees happy and calm during a situation. They may not know what's going on. So making sure someone is in charge of telling them what to do is really important as well. Great.
Next slide.
No.
Huh?
No, it's fine.
Okay.
And then so we're going to also make sure that we're running crisis drills too. We want to be prepared. This is a lot like tabletop exercises. So making sure you're prepared when a crisis happens is really going to be crucial when it comes to timing when something hits. All right, and then so I made some key phrases to use. When it comes to message development, we want to keep it as simple as possible. Like we had said, a lot of people don't understand cybersecurity. So your grandma at home is not going to understand what a phishing email is. So like that's a really good example of how we're going to keep it simple when it comes to messaging. Don't be afraid to say that we're investigating rather than just giving out wrong information, because that can bite you in the butt in the end. We're going to outline specific actions being taken. People want to know if like the Colonial Pipeline, if a critical infrastructure site went down, they want to know when it's going to be back up and what they can expect. So some key phrases to use are, instead of no comment, we're going to say we're gathering all the facts and then we'll share when confirmed. And say, instead of saying it's not our fault, we're going to be focused on resolving the situation. Instead of saying everything is fine, we're going to say here's what we know and here's what we're doing. And instead of saying we think, we're going to say we have confirmed. Good.
I swear I didn't break it.
You're the cybersecurity person here.
Yeah, so I've been in executive management too long, so I don't know how to use technology anymore. So yeah, exactly.
He was the one saying using PowerPoints, and I was using Google Slides, so we had a little bit of miscommunication there.
Yeah, it's all good. So we had talked earlier about safe channels, right? And so so the reason why I'm speaking to this is, depending on the nature of this, the crisis at hand, the digital crisis, kind of informs what communication channels you should use. So when Kat and I were working on this, I talked about previous experience where, so like in a previous use case, we talked about how there was malicious payload being deployed via social media. So let's say you got popped, you downloaded something, and all of a sudden you have Maze ransomware or something, which true story, almost happened in Maricopa County, heavy emphasis on almost. And so if you get popped by ransomware, you shouldn't be doing things, and you shouldn't be using communication channels like email, because you should be operating under the assumption that the threat actors are still in your environment, right? So any sort of internal communication channels are no-go, at least for communicating how you're responding to the incident or communicating status, especially if you're trying to communicate with third parties like insurance, law enforcement, things of that sort. So email's out the window. Internal intranet site definitely should be out the window. If you're primarily, for example, Teams organization, you might want to consider having an alternate Slack, outside of your environment to communicate with other agencies or partners or people that you rely on, that sort of thing. So, but then also from a communication standpoint, some channels are appropriate, right, Kat? So using social media, depending on the nature of the crisis, you might want to go to where a majority of your audience is paying attention to and things of that sort. So the website for official statements and things of that sort. And then, do people still do press releases?
We do press releases, but they're not like press conferences. So it's usually when a company has an update for something that's happening with them. So not really for this.
Well, Maricopa County does press conferences.
Media alerts, I feel like that's all right.
Yeah. So anyways, so just something to keep in mind with regards to safe channels to use. So you want to take that into context.
So what about Slack, or not Slack, but Signal and WhatsApp? Because I know I have a lot of reporters that will only communicate with me over Signal if it's sensitive information. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it's appropriate. I think the thing that you want to be cognizant about is the crisis team and the people responding to the incident, do they know that you're going to use those platforms for that communication? And does it meet your regulatory and compliance needs, things of that nature? And so depending on the crisis at hand, I would argue, even from a public sector perspective, not everything is public record, right? And so as long as all parties involved, from an organizational perspective, know that you're using that tool and it's acceptable and it meets your compliance and regulatory requirements, then yeah, it's all good.
All right, so how do we monitor what is happening in social media? I don't think my head's as big, so it's not showing that. Okay, cool. So I made a list for you guys. Feel free to screenshot that if you find it helpful. I made a list of social media monitoring tools and then news and media monitoring tools, and oh no.
I swear that wasn't me. Yeah, fair enough.
Oh, there we go. That's great. Okay. So my favorite for social media monitoring is Hootsuite because you get a lot of insights when it comes to monitoring all of your social media channels, not just one. So that one's really great. I haven't really used Sprout Social before. I'm pretty stuck on the way Hootsuite is. For news and media monitoring, Meltwater is really good. For global media monitoring, there's Cision. So there's a lot of PR and media tracking there. You can do social media monitoring with that one too, but it's not as good. I don't like Cision in general, but they're kind of the best of the best. So, and then there's good old Google Alerts. That one's cheap. It's free. And I also use that one as well as Cision. So it doesn't give you the real-time alerts like Cision does. So you may get a story a few hours later, or you may get it the next day. It really kind of depends. So it's a little unreliable, but it's still good when it comes to monitoring what's going on in the news.
Yeah. And so this is an interesting slide from a cybersecurity perspective. When Ken and I were talking about it, interestingly enough, at least in my previous experience, my cybersecurity team actually leveraged Brandwatch and Hootsuite as well, because the challenge from a cybersecurity perspective is other than X, and they increased the price to see. I didn't touch anything. So they increased the price to access their backend API for public posts, right? But other than them, none of the other major social media platforms actually sell access via API. And so there's really not a way to monitor from a cybersecurity perspective those platforms. So we would actually use the same tools that you use from a communication perspective to get a sense on what is being said about the organization. So if Maricopa County or ASU or whatever was trending in the negative, that would be our initial canary in the coal mine to say, okay, maybe we should then go use our traditional tools, see if we've seen an increase in our SIM or whatever other source of truth, our firewall logs, et cetera, and would see anomalous behavior. But from a legal perspective, a lot of the social media platforms, even if you try to do data scraping on their platforms for public posts, that violates their EULAs. And so you're not able to do that. So unfortunately, from a SecOps perspective, that's not really an option. So in that instance, we tend to use similar tools to get a sense on what is trending from an organizational perspective. Then we'll go down, drill down, and use our traditional cybersecurity tools, if that makes sense. So
there's also this way. I'm a huge stalker on the internet when it comes to following reporters.
Should you really be admitting that?
Definitely. I'm not afraid of anyone knowing that.
Okay.
So I will follow my favorite reporters, the one that I talk to the most, and I will look at what they're putting out every single day, and I will communicate with them on Twitter and just kind of follow what they're talking about. So we'll go through, I know we're running late on time, so when it comes to you're dealing with a crisis situation and it's over, I just want to say some of the key things to do are analyze what happened. How long did it take for your team to respond? What kind of way did the narrative shift if you put out a statement? What did the news say? What were reporters saying? Who communicated with you? And most importantly, document everything. It's going to be key to understanding what happens next time, because there's always going to be a next time in our industry. And you can learn from what happened now and make things faster next time.
So what are some key takeaways, Kat, from your perspective?
I think as cybersecurity and comms teams, we really need to get over our ego. So it's not about that. It's about protecting people. And that's kind of why I feel like a lot of people in cybersecurity get into the job, is to protect people. So making sure that you're working with your team to communicate properly what's happening, I think, is my key takeaway.
And I guess mine, again, based off of the scar tissue that I've built up, especially over the last 10 years, is the traditional way of protecting your organization doesn't work anymore. And so taking a very siloed, myopic view, I'm a comms team, I'm only going to do this. I'm a SecOps team, I'm only going to do this. I'm a emergency management and response team, I'm only going to do this. That no longer works. Organizations don't care about that delineation. They care about the nature of risk against their organization. The risk landscape is changing. More organizations are being impacted from a reputational risk perspective. They're seeing that quantified as a result. So that's the definition of insanity, right? Doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results. If we try to protect our organizations in our limited fashions, in our silos, we're going to continue to be unsuccessful despite our desire to be successful. So we need
unless you're weightlifting, you do the same thing over and over again, you get like a really good result.
Yeah, well, okay. So is that a dig on my physical health and appearance?
I feel like you're taking that personally, so that's your fault.
I am. So anyways, hopefully you are able, the last thing to take away from this is that social media poses a new threat, in particular from a misinformation and everything associated with it, and that at an organizational level, your org should take that into consideration. So
I also want to add that we are dealing with real people that are scared in these situations. So we need to be able to make sure that we're communicating properly to people and calming everyone down. So do we have time for questions?
Or no?
So, real quickly, I was just kidding when I said this was our last talk. There was a schedule. We do have one more talk right after you. So,
anyways,
a couple minutes.
All right, I do have my LinkedIn here. If you guys have any questions, if you need help with anything, I'm more than happy to help anyone who needs anything. I know it's a QR code, but I promise it's safe. All right, thank you, everyone.